Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I have a wide-ranging conversation with the designer and educator Erik Brandt. Erik is probably best known for his curatorial project Ficciones Typografika, where for the last 5 years he turned a 24 by 36 inch frame on the side of his garage in Minneapolis into a really interesting rotating exhibition of work that has been submitted by graphic designers from all around the world. The project just finished and has been commemorated in a book published by Formist that just came out last month. Erik is also a professor and the chair of the graphic design program at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and that's where we begin this conversation. We talk a lot about design education and Erik's teaching philosophy, but we also talk about his background growing up all around the world and his undergraduate studies in philosophy and how this all led to a career in graphic design. And we talk about how to work on projects that create dialogue and community and how to be a designer that stays creative throughout your entire life. This was truly a wonderful conversation. I found Erik's thoughts to be just so generous and inspiring, and I hope that you enjoy it too. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that goes out at the beginning of every month and sort of expands on the themes of the podcast, previews upcoming episodes, and shares relevant and interesting links and stories around design and criticism and writing and practice and all the stuff that we talk about each week on the podcast. These memberships really help with the ongoing production of Scratching the Surface, so if you enjoy the show and want to help out, I'd love for you to join the membership program. Thank you, as always, for your support, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Erik Brandt. In preparing for this, I had read a bunch of other interviews that you've done, and I watched a panel that you were on at the AIGA Island Design Conference about design education.
Right.
And you had a line in there that really struck me. And you said that you see your approach to design, you see your approach to teaching. It's something you kind of talk to your students about and to your colleagues about, that all of design and kind of new media all falls under this concept of the reconciliation of projected and reflected light.
Yeah.
And you kind of said that, and then you just kind of moved on a little bit. And I would love to start with that because I found that such a fascinating phrase. What does the reconciliation of projected and reflected light mean?
Well, that concept actually came out of my work here at MCAD, where when I first got here, I was asked to start teaching, along with graphic design, some 2D foundation classes. And so I actually really love teaching that class precisely because it's not a design class. But there was, and I think this is true of other schools too, there was an impression, especially amongst fine arts faculty at MCAD, that the 2D foundation class was like a secret funnel into the design department, just because of the way the let's say traditional problems were set up, etc. And I think there actually was some truth to that. But my approach to the class really worked under this umbrella concept of reconciling projected and reflected light, because I wanted to give the students, no matter, most of them hadn't decided a major yet, I wanted to give them that same umbrella to work under, because it seems to me that no matter what discipline you eventually major in or what life you pursue, that issue is going to be at the heart of it.
Right.
We're all making things, and if they're digital, if they're real, they have to be reconciled in some way. A book is going to have to be represented in a digital format. A book is going to have to be real in reflected light, so to speak. So a lot of the work that I do with students and the work that I do on my own really, focuses on this. And I think it's, perhaps it's kind of an outdated concept too, because especially in this day and age when everything is so much focused on the digital, it's often a massive surprise, especially to, I think, to beginners, to actually see something that they've been making.
Right.
And so, I've devised some, what I like to call, exquisite torture problems that, so for example, in approaching color theory, my interest is to have them working in color digitally and in reflected projected light environments at the same time, so they understand that they're manipulating these things and that they can manipulate them and they can't rely on what they see, so to speak. And that's been really enjoyable. And I know, through some of the problems, the torturous aspect of it is real. But I've, over the years, thankfully, have heard from many students back that they still remember those confrontations, and how to keep them with them.
I'm curious, kind of as you're presenting this to your students and as you are kind of setting up the class this way, do the students get it? Are they kind of on board with that? And the reason I ask that is because I'm thinking about my own foundation classes,
right?
And just probably being a little bit arrogant, probably kind of thinking I already knew what design was and what I wanted to do. Felt like why are we doing these types of projects? Like, this is not what I came to school for. What are your students like when you kind of present it in this almost kind of abstract, kind of blurring the lines between disciplines way?
Right. I think, I imagine that, it's a typical, breakdown. There's some that have immediate buy-in, some that are in the middle, and some, as you're describing, and perhaps rightfully so, because they might feel like, oh gosh, this isn't for me, because they feel they are fluent digitally in a sense, and in many ways they are. There's an aspect of that problem that I give that begins with really intense study of color theory, but it's an idiosyncratic approach to the theory. They have to literally mix the colors themselves, and that's where the rubber really hits the road. And you end up having fantastic conversations. I remember one group, they were all to a person really frustrated with purple, and it was such a great discussion, because they were, I was like, oh, let's talk about this. Well, what's the story here? A little red, a little blue, and they're like, oh yeah, but that's not the way it turns out, and that. And but the problem actually evolves into a time-based setting as well, and often there is when it really clicks, because at that point I'll be able to say, you, more than any other generation before you, are probably unbelievably fluent in cinematic techniques without even knowing it, because you've been exposed to all the tricks, so to speak, and whether you know it or not, you have these these approaches at your command, and that's where it kind of all comes together. And then we start talking about sound and rhythm and time sequence, and and developing things, and then but still thinking really about color and representing that, and is it captured the right way, is it projected the right way, etc. So yeah, it's a process. I mean, I like to think I'm enthusiastic, and I try to project that, and but I know, especially at the initial stages, it's pretty laborious. But that's part of my obligation.
right. Yeah, I love that. I mean, something that I'm really interested in is kind of, like I mentioned earlier, kind of blurring the lines between these disciplines, and not being so rigid about this is graphic design, this is art, this is industrial design, this is digital design. I really like kind of confusing those a little bit and kind of mixing them up a little bit. And so I'd like to talk about your background a little bit, because you grew up literally all around the world, and you originally studied philosophy, right?
That's right.
And so I'm kind of curious how that background maybe influences that kind of approach to design that you were just talking about.
For me, I was studying philosophy at William and Mary, and I think it's true in most American programs. They're more, let's say, they're more interested in sort of the pragmatists, the Peirces, the Russells, etc. And I was more interested in the so-called continental philosophers. What in those programs they actually consider more to be literature, as opposed to philosophy. But I think what I got out of that in the most thorough way was really a desire and a process for asking questions.
Mm,
It wasn't so much a matter of understanding the canon, so to speak, and writing on this and writing on that. It was really more about how to ask and how to look for the right questions. And I think that was, in a way, a perfect preparation. What I didn't know then, it was a perfect preparation for graphic design, because that's of course what we do. Whenever
right.
we come up with uh, have a new challenge or something like that, we're asking questions. We're trying to find, obviously, solutions. But I'm very enamored of that question asking part of the process. And so I think that was,
Yeah.
yeah, that was the key issue that I discovered in that study.
And so then how did you go from studying philosophy to eventually getting an MFA in
Yeah.
design?
Well, after school, I went back to Germany and I was teaching there for a little while, and then I had a chance to go to Japan. And like most people, when I first got there, I was teaching English,
Mm.
but I discovered an English speaking monthly was starting up in the city where I was in Fukuoka, which is in Kyushu, the southern island. And I approached them because I had, ironically, had been drawing this really silly comic, mostly for friends. And I just went into their editorial office and introduced myself and said, I have this silly comic. And they really, they really loved it, because it was really, I think it was really bad, but it was not a manga comic. So it was actually, in its own way, very popular there. But as I started working with them more, they figured out that I could write, that I could edit. And so I started, freelancing for them, doing some small reporting, some film reviews and things like that. And eventually I just talked them into hiring me full time. And from there, I started working with all these fantastic Japanese graphic designers and learning cork in Japanese characters. And it was such a great experience. I mean, I was a total neophyte, but I had really good teachers, and I quickly learned that I didn't know anything about what I was doing. But that position, and we were quite advanced, actually. We were already. I mean, I had an Apple 145B laptop with a
Nice.
9600K modem, and I
Yeah.
was I was the fastest man in the city. And we worked with designers all over the world. But you had to download stuff overnight. But they would use my computer to do that because I had a faster modem. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience. So by the time I came back to the States and I started work at another newspaper, I knew I wanted more. And ironically, years before, when I was still studying philosophy, I was also taking art classes. And I had a teacher
Okay.
there who at one point told me, like, you should really think about studying graphic design, and you should go to VCU. And I had no idea what she was talking about at the time.
Yeah.
But later on, it all clicked, and they let me in. I was the weirdo there at VCU.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's how it happened.
I didn't realize that while you were studying philosophy, you were also taking art classes. I'm curious about that kind of dynamic. What was it? Can you kind of take us back to that time? What were you interested in that you were both in these philosophy classes, but then you're also taking art classes? What what was that like? What were you thinking about at the time?
Well, yeah, I mean, since I think, like many people, obviously, like most people, I've been drawing
Hmm.
and painting since I was a kid. And my mother was very creative. My father was more of an intellectual. So it's actually
Okay.
kind of
Okay.
kind of the perfect balance. But yeah, for me, the art classes were, it was another world, and it was a really soothing world, and something that surprised me. That in taking some of the beginning classes there. I didn't expect the kind of response that I was getting from professors. It was really encouraging. It was really
Hmm.
supportive, and for me, it was just a way of working through problems in another way. And so, whether it was doing dimensional work or two-dimensional work, I found another way of being myself. But I tell you honestly, it didn't click in that way until much later. I didn't, yeah, I didn't see it as I mean, I made stupid flyers for, our silly little punk rock band that we were in together, my friends and I, and the very famous Swiss Family Manson. And I had no clue what I was doing. That
Yeah.
was actually a pathway for the future.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because when I was in grad school, my MFA was obviously in graphic design, but I had a concentration in critical theory. And so
Ah,
for my 2 years in grad school, I was taking like half studio kind of traditional graphic design classes, and then the other half were kind of seminar philosophy classes.
yeah, brilliant.
And when I look back on that time, I'm like kind of mad at myself of how long it took me to see the connections between both of those.
Yeah,
And like the way the schedule was, it was like the first half, it was like Monday and Tuesday were my design classes. And then I had like Wednesdays off or something like that. And then Thursday and Friday, I was in these writing and philosophy classes. And so it felt like I had this really kind of weird split week where I was like bouncing back between two different things. And then
yeah,
all of a sudden it clicked and I realized how connected they were. But it took me a long time to kind of see that connection. So I was kind of
yeah.
curious to hear your experience of something, somewhat similar.
Oh, I can totally relate. I mean, when I was in graduate school, when it really clicked, I had the same feeling, like, oh my gosh, like I could have been doing this so much earlier.
Yeah.
It was interesting because when I first started, I was kind of I think the odd part of the group, the first year group.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't gone to an undergraduate program, so a lot of the vocabulary was, not
Right.
within my experience, and so there was a lot of catching up that I did. That was really fun, and I was in my studio 24/7. I just loved every minute of it. But yeah, no, I can totally relate to that. But it was actually some of my teachers back then. I was really fortunate. Who were helping me make those connections. They saw some of the early process I was developing, and what I really struggled with back then. I didn't have a problem with developing process. I had a problem with finishing things,
Right.
and
Yeah, we're the same. We're
yeah,
exactly the same.
I couldn't complete projects. And I remember going to my graduate director, John Malinowski, at the time and saying, like, what do I do? This is, there's just too much work. It's so much work. And he's like, no, no, your problem is that you don't have enough work. You need more work. And what he meant was that you needed, in a very simple way, you needed an aspect of working that was more hobby-like, that was more personal and private. And
Mm.
once I started engaging in that kind of work, I it all clicked, because then I realized, like, I was making these helmets, and then I realized that they were really typographic in sense.
Right,
and
right.
and so that, and I think, so many people have that experience where you're like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this my whole life, I just never knew it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was the other that you started answering exactly my next question because I was curious about your time in Japan and then eventually going to grad school, I guess, where you mentioned that you were writing, you were drawing these comics, and for me, when I kind of discovered design and I discovered graphic design or realized graphic design was the thing that I was interested in and wanted to do when I was probably 14 or 15 years old.
Mm.
But before that, I was this kid who was just interested in a lot of things. I like read a lot. I drew a lot. I was interested in I thought I wanted to be an architect. I watched
Same.
a lot of I watched a lot of movies. There's just like all this stuff that I
Yeah,
like really wanted to do. And when I found design, that seemed like a way to bring all of those things together. And
exactly.
that
Yeah.
all of these different things I was interested in, I could actually look at through a design lens. And yeah, it sounds like you. And I'm curious, was that your experience kind of when you were working at the magazine, when you then went to grad school? Did design feel like this way to kind of connect all of these things you're interested in?
Exactly. And I mean, it's like I say to students all the time, and to friends too. I mean, we get to play with all the toys, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
But and that expression actually came from a really pivotal discussion I had in my life with one of my philosophy professors, who actually came from a physics background. He had a background in cosmology. And I remember talking to him and saying, like, wow, how did you move from, thinking and trying to describe the universe to philosophy? And he actually just looked me right in the eye and he said, I just wanted to play with the big toys. And I thought, oh my God, what is he talking about? And then we talked about it and he was like, no, I wanted to be able to be more free. And, for me, that, as you're describing too, I think that
Yeah.
that's the excitement with graphic design, is that now there's a danger there too. Too much of this, master of none, so to speak, type of thing.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I mean, in our time, and going back to the '90s, and I know that this term has come into play recently, this idea of a generalist. I think nowadays people are talking about it more in terms of, being able to work in many aspects of graphic design. But I think in my time, a generalist was somebody who is, as you're describing, well read, well studied,
Right.
interested in everything, and in that way, I think well prepared for life in graphic design, because it is an opportunity for endless learning
Yeah.
and for infinite projection.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's funny how just to kind of quickly go back to talking about finishing projects. I was the same way, where I was actually just thinking about this the other day, that I have, a dozen kind of quote unquote personal projects that I've started that are just kind of sitting there. And I remember a couple years ago kind of realizing that the part that I had trouble finishing was when it actually got to the detailed design stuff.
Right.
When it got into the really setting the type, kerning the letters, kind of
Right.
selecting this color or that color, like that's where I would actually start to kind of get bored and lose interest, because the ideas, the concepts, the asking questions, that part of the process was over.
Yeah.
And that was the part that actually I kind of realized that I was really excited about.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I had the same experience. I mean, I have really great admiration for, and actually, I was talking about this with a friend of mine from, the guys in Italy, Studio Moot,
Oh yeah.
Thomas Kronblicher, and we were talking about that. And and I was saying, like, as we're describing, I have this real problem with finishing, and he said, "Oh, that's not a problem for me. I know when it's done." And I was like, "Wow, I really admire that. I wish I had
Yeah.
that, but I don't. I always feel there's something more." I think I told him there hasn't been anything that I finished and either sent off to press or sent in where I didn't the next day say, "Oh man, I wish I could have done this, I could have done that."
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that's healthy. I mean, you're always you're always checking yourself. You're always maybe a little suspicious that something could have been better or something. I think that's a healthy tendency too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I literally have gone back to student projects from my undergrad years and have redesigned them after the fact, because I thought they weren't quite
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
later. And I always I think it was Da Vinci who said, or, this has maybe been attributed to Da Vinci. I don't know if he actually said it, but something to the effect of, a painting is never finished, only abandoned. And that's kind of how
Yeah.
I've come to think about all of my work, is
Yeah,
that it's just abandoned. Like
yeah.
nothing's actually ever finished.
No, it's perfect you bring that up, because I've for some reason I've always had wherever I've lived, I've always had a close friend that was a painter, and I think that's kind of
Mm,
coincidence, but there's something about that. But what I've always admired about and envied to some degree was the ability of painters to work a painting for
mm,
however long, as many times as I would, let's say, go to someone's studio and see something in progress and then come back and see it's totally changed, completely painted over. But what's so amazing is that all their process is preserved, and they actually use that to
right.
build the painting, etc. And I think we have the same amount of work goes into creating graphic design. But let's say once it goes to an offset press, all those layers are gone.
Right. Right.
And
Right.
I think you see some people trying to preserve aspects of that. But yeah, I think that's really fascinating.
Is that so? Maybe that's a way that we can talk about your ongoing project that just wrapped up, and I'm nervous that I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Ficciones Typografika.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Ficciones Typografika. Yeah,
Okay,
that's really good.
nice. I should have asked you that before we
That's
started
okay.
recording. But I see that project as kind of actually now in the context of this conversation, that project kind of connects all of these things we're talking about, where, um, it's kind of you kind of bringing people together. It's you kind of approaching design from a more personal, maybe a more kind of art approach. Um,
Sure.
how,
Yeah.
how do you see that project kind of fitting into your larger practice and kind of connecting to these things we've been talking about?
You're exactly right. And the project actually evolved out of really the same process we were just talking about. About I think it's about 12 years ago, I started a blog called Typografika, and
Okay.
that was a more let's say traditional, approach where I was finding certain designers or artists and then writing about them. And at the beginning, it was more of a way to interact with my students and provide content to
Mm,
them. But then it grew, and I realized people were actually reading it, and became more opinionated, etc. And much later, when I first started thinking about doing this project, I was building this. It was just going to be a place for me to play privately,
mm,
and yet in a public way. But literally as I was building the board, I was in my garage, tinkering with some stuff, and I was like, oh man, wait a second, I have to no this I have to make this. I'll
right.
start by inviting people, and it's the perfect continuation of that same approach, which is just really trying to engage with the world in a way.
Hmm.
And in this way, it was sort of an open brief. It was very loosely defined, and that allowed, I think, a really a gathering of people, that I don't know. It for me, it was so perfect because I didn't have to say anything, but it had such a, in my view anyway, it
Right.
had such a powerful voice and a powerful presence, and it was other people's voices that made it that way, not necessarily mine. So it was really liberating. It was just it was a really joyful experience.
You're forcing me to kind of rethink my own work in some new ways. And I think this podcast is actually doing something very similar to your project, in that it was a way to a bring a bunch of interests that we had kind of together
Right.
into one project. And if I'm really honest, this podcast has evolved to basically become a way for me to talk to people that I'm interested in.
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and it's a way to bring people together. It's a way to kind of create a community. It's a way to start some sort of dialogue, but to do that in celebration of, or kind of to raise voices of other people.
Yeah.
Uh, and I didn't see that connection until just as you were kind of talking about it.
Well, I think that's what drew me to your project too. I mean, I'm really drawn to exactly that. Where wherever there are efforts, to bring idiosyncratic voices together, and
Right,
and
right.
allow them to be themselves. I think that's especially important in this day and age. And I think it's a nice evolution. And I know, for example, so early in the blogosphere days, that was the concern of, let's say,
Yeah,
the editorial class within,
right,
whatever discipline, that, oh my gosh, the so-called democracy is going to overwhelm the well-heeled opinions that should matter, right?
right.
Okay, there's something to that, but I was always much more interested in the sort of radical democracy that the internet
Mm,
promised. And I had that connection very early on. And I was telling you earlier about my working in Japan. I mean, we were still working in rudimentary environments, but Apple had a social service out there. It was called eWorld, and
oh,
I
right.
remember it blowing my mind, that oh my gosh, this is it. This is total democracy. Everybody has their little node, and you can be an individual, and at the same time, you know.
Mhm.
So of course we can see today the the extremes of the negative in
Right.
that, but at the same time, yeah, no, I mean that project for me was, ironically, when it first started, I my friend Benoit Bourtuin, when I was still doing invitation only to the project, he's a really great type designer in France. He encouraged me to open it up for submissions, and I was a little worried about that because I didn't want to be the sort of curator that I was describing earlier that would that
Right.
would say no. Um,
Yeah.
but I was really surprised because the quality increased. I mean, I was worried that I was going to get massive amounts of submissions, and I did. But excuse me, they were actually really high quality submissions. And what I
Oh, interesting.
more often than not, I didn't reject pieces outright. I would let them sit, and over the course of time, the project started developing this sort of long term narrative. And there would come a time on occasion where something that at first I thought, oh, I'm not sure, it just fit right in. And so then it would
Mhm.
come up. So, unfortunately, and I have to extend my apologies. I mean, there were some people that waited 3 years for their piece
Oh, wow.
to go up. But, I would often contact people and say, hey, I think the timing is just right for this. What do you think? Is it still reflective of your work? And, we would have a
Mm.
discussion and then it would go up.
How did that process and kind of, being that curator that you're kind of talking about and being a part of that dialogue and just the project in general, how did that influence or affect the work that you were doing outside of the project?
Yeah,
Whether that was teaching, whether that was kind of more traditional design work, your other kind of personal work. How
yeah.
did those start to talk to each other?
Well, it's really interesting actually because I mean, as a teacher, I've always tried, and I believe this, and I really hope it's true. I've always tried to be as open minded as possible with students, and to teach from and to their idiosyncrasy, as opposed to introducing them to a certain approach. Let's say let's build up from modernism and the expression first you have to learn the rules and then you can break them. And actually I don't believe in that at all. I really think that what I'm trying to say is that as a teacher I think I have a great amount of not just patience but respect for what someone might dream up, and I think
Right.
that comes from my background, not coming from a traditional approach or a traditional education. Um, so I think that's really the heart of it is really allowing other voices to have their say, not judging it. Aesthetically, there were certainly, for example, parts of the project where, and I've said this elsewhere, that I wasn't necessarily enamored of the aesthetic, but I trusted it in a way, and
Mm-hmm.
I was often really surprised too by I would think to myself as I was hanging something, because there's this sort of private part of the project where it's just me in the garage and making some wheat paste, and I would think, oh man, no one's going to like this one, and then that one would get a huge response, on social media. So
Right.
that was always a way of reminding myself too that you really have no idea.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it's much better to be a part of a larger conversation as opposed to a specific one within a certain orientation or
Mm-hmm.
manifesto or something like that. I've had colleagues that I've always greatly admired. That they've for example, in their work, you can see that they've really chosen a path. Let's say it's
Mm-hmm.
just for discussion. Let's say it's a modernist path, and I've always admired that. Like, wow, they're so dedicated to that aesthetic and to that way of thinking, and that could never be me. you know,
Right.
I
Right.
remember I remember a conversation around those issues. Somebody, a teacher of mine, I think it was John Malinowski again, he asked me, "Well, are you a minimalist or are you?" And I would say, "Oh yes, yes, I'm a minimalist. I really." And then I would go back to my studio or my apartment, and it's just this huge collection of stuff, and it's like, God, I'm not a minimalist at all. There's
Right.
nothing there's
Right.
nothing
Right.
about that in me. And so those things, yeah, you discover those things, I think.
I want to talk more about that approach kind of in the classroom, actually, because that's something that I think about all the time. And I'm doing more and more teaching, and that's kind of where I see my career headed is kind
Hmm.
of spending more and more time in the classroom. And like you, I try to really let the students lead and try to teach to kind of individual interests and to the individual students.
Hmm.
But I also I maybe as someone who came up in a design school, both undergraduate and graduate level, went through all of those design history classes.
Hmm.
Um, that are oversimplified and kind of present these things aesthetically and very linearly.
Yeah.
And I kind of intellectually know that that is not the way that I want to teach those things. And
Sure.
I intellectually believe that you don't have to teach the rules to break the rules,
Right.
but it's really hard when I'm standing
Yeah.
in front of the students to then actually do that.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how you do that.
No, I totally agree. I think there has to be a balance. My colleague here at MCAD, Jan Jancourt, and I were just talking about this exact issue the other day. Now, when he was in graduate school, he was at Cranbrook in the heyday
Right.
of postmodernist work, and he was really at the forefront of some of that. And I remember he just told me the other day that when he came to teaching, he had absolutely zero interest in any modernist principles. But then he quickly discovered that it was a perfect vehicle to deliver exactly what we're describing, essentially
Right.
the essence of the practice. And I think that's why he's such a wonderful teacher. And I think that's my conflict is where I say, oh, I'm teaching from and to idiosyncrasy. My especially at the let's say introductory level classes, but this is mirrored in advanced level classes too. I do try to, I think it's fair to say, take some risks with the students. And there has to be a certain point when you realize, no matter what you're delivering alongside their work through lectures or examples, people that you're bringing to their attention, there has to be a point where you say, well, okay, but then, here are some I wouldn't call them foundational issues, but here are some things that could help you ground yourself.
Mhm.
And I it's funny because there's always a discussion about would you like to create a book or make a book or write a book about introduction to typography or introduction to design. And I think that is the scariest question anybody can ask you because if I think of Armin Hoffman, Emil Ruda, Müller
Right.
Brockmann, you don't need any other foundational books, and at the same time, that's the canon that we are, especially nowadays, justifiably suspicious of. But gosh, it's a really fantastic, beginning. To think of those seminal volumes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there has to be a balance in interacting with the student and I think the hardest part is getting them, especially at the introductory level, to understand the level to which they have to aspire,
Mm.
and to know the obligation they have to this tradition, not as I'm going to be a practitioner like that, but to understand how many people around the world are engaged in this discipline, and why you should be suspicious of the textbook, so to speak, right?
Right.
The
Right.
history book, because you have to ask yourself at some point, well, which one is the right one, right? Uh,
Right.
my gosh, the way that some of my colleagues in Germany approach typographic education. I mean, there are literal laws for how to appropriately, set type in some ways. But
Yeah.
those ideas don't translate very well in other cultures. So I mean, again, but to me, that's the promise of graphic design, that it is infinitely variable, infinitely
Right.
possible, right?
I love everything that you just said, and the conflict that I feel like I encounter every course that I teach, and especially when I'm teaching kind of introductory type classes or kind of sophomore level typography classes, is that I kind of basically present this paradox, but I don't present it as a paradox. And I say, none of this stuff that I'm telling you are rules.
Right.
These are just kind of ideas. This is one way of doing something. But then when we're in critique, I fall back on them as if they're rules.
Yes.
I'm like, oh, you should kern this a little bit, or like, oh, this grid feels off.
Right.
And I struggle to find the balance between that. Here are the things that you need to know to get a job.
Right.
Here are the things that people expect from a graphic designer, but here's how you can also be experimental and you can try new things. And I talked to Mitch Goldstein about this when I had him on the podcast, and he said something that was really refreshing to me. He's like, the way he treats it is that he is not the only teacher that those students will have. So if he doesn't teach it, they will learn it from someone else. And I like that, but I also feel a little bit like if I do that, that's a little bit of a cop-out. And so
Yeah.
maybe the question that I'm asking you is how you kind of think about that conflict, and also as somebody who is a chair of a program, how you kind of structure a program to have both sides of those.
Yeah. No, I love that. That's such a great expression, and I can totally relate to that. I often tell students that essentially, yes, your portfolio, for example, as you're leaving school or as you're looking for an internship, it should be modular in nature. You should be able to adapt it to the studio, the person, the place that you're applying to, and it has to be reflective of your abilities, not necessarily reflective of your genius. Having said that, in a critique situation, the way I try to allow for a little bit of a balance. Yes, I am and can be, and I do act as an authority figure in engaging with the material and say, well, this is how I feel about it. But what I challenge and ask the students to do is to create argument. And I mean that it is their responsibility to both present and defend their work. And a successful argument is always going to be subjective at its heart, but a successful argument and the ability to provide a successful argument for what you are doing and why you're doing it is really perhaps even more important than the design itself, because we're always fond of talking about explaining work to clients, explaining to work to colleagues, etc., and the problems therein, but that's really what it comes down to. I mean, it's always going to be a subjective morass, there's and thank God, we wouldn't want it any other way. We wouldn't want graphic design to be defined, let's say, as plumbing is codified, right? There are certain standards that a plumber must be able to apply and respect and observe to make things work. And surely we can say the same of graphic design, but we don't want that kind of structure because we want this infinite possibility. So that's my concern with students, is to tell them, listen, I'm going to tell you that your work is awful, but I'm going to be open-minded in your approach to convince me otherwise. I think that's a key skill, and that's a key engagement in that process of critique.
So you just finished up Ficciones Typografika. You have a book that just came out kind of commemorating that project.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about now? What's next for you? What are the things that you're kind of interested in now?
That's a really difficult question. I had all along with Ficciones, I would submit my own pieces, and they were invariably, and this is just because it's me, they were very invariably political in nature. So I've actually started a side project called Typografika Politica, which it takes place on the same surface, and it involves at this point only my work, and I think it's probably going to stay that way. But it's moving at a much slower pace because, and I think I've just reached a stage in my life where I'm really debating the way forward.
Right.
And it's really hard to define. I mean, I've often said that I want to, and I believe it's possible, in design to keep growing as a graphic designer.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I think it's natural that there are stages in your life where the questions start coming, maybe a little more seriously about why this and what's this about. So it's really hard to put a an expression or a definition together for what I'm doing. What I think I'm doing now more than I've ever done is more drawing,
Oh,
and
interesting.
trying and really just trying to, I think, in some strange way maybe even recapture some of the discipline that I think I not necessarily have lost, but I think, and I think this is true, especially
Yeah.
as a chair. Once you're more engaged with other things, administrative duties, etc., you do lose a significant amount of studio time. So I found that that's a really easy way for me to, even in quick moments, to still ask questions of myself. And so we'll see where that leads to.
We mentioned how we're very similar in that we have kind of a lot of interests and that we're really good at starting projects. And I'm curious how, thinking about my own work, I have an interest in writing more. I
Hmm.
also want to kind of get back into just kind of traditional graphic design that I did 15 years ago,
Right.
that I feel like I've kind of lost a little bit because I've
Hmm.
moved away from that. I want
Sure.
to do more kind of arty projects that are outside of my client work. And it's just like, oh, I have all this stuff that I want to do. How do I how do I do it all? How do you think about that and kind of move between these different modes and projects?
I think, I've often, I remember one of my professors, Ben Day, talked to me about time management years ago, gosh, 20 some plus years ago. And in this, similar to the discussion I had with John Malinowski back then too, I think the key is, and I try to tell students this as well, the key, as I think as designers, but I think as human beings too, there's a certain, um, pleasure, and there's also a certain obligation to to not focusing too much time on one thing. Meaning, it's better to
Mm,
split your time up, to have half an hour here, to have an hour here, where you focus on these things. And some people might, well, that's normal, that's natural. You have to be flexible. You can't just devote 10 hours a day to one thing. But I think it's easy to fall into that kind of trap. There's an aspect of discipline that I am certainly not a master of or an example of, but that I often refer to. The author Thomas Mann, who grew up
oh
in the
yeah.
same city where I lived as a boy in Germany. He had a habit of every single morning, no matter what, he would sit down at his desk and stay there and either write or just stare at a piece of
Right.
paper
Right.
for a length
Right.
of time. And it was now, some might look at that as a little bit extreme, but I think it's something to keep in mind. That, and fortunately, I still have the example of my teachers, people like John, who are still incredibly prolific and make me
Mm,
feel ashamed of what I have not yet accomplished with my life. And so,
right.
I think those things are key too. That allowing yourself to still be inspired and still feel maybe a little bit unconfident.
Yeah. Yeah. My last question, and this leads in nicely because you were kind of mentioning some people who have kind of influenced you or inspired you. And this is a question I use to end all of these conversations. I'm curious, who are the people, the authors, designers, the books that have really influenced how you kind of think about all of this that we've been talking about?
Oh gosh, one of the Ficciones project was named, in part. Ficciones is a term, Spanish for fiction, but from especially from the work of the author Jorge Luis Borges,
Oh yeah.
who I'm a great admirer of, and his book of Imaginary Beings is one of the most
Oh yeah.
influential books of my life. and also, magical realism in general. The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov is, I think, one of my favorite
I
things.
don't know that one.
It's a must read.
Okay.
It's a brilliant book. It involves actually two stories that are happening, but I think you'd really enjoy it. It's a fantastic experience.
Adding it to the list right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I was just recently in Moscow, and I had a chance to actually go on a tour with a really brilliant docent who showed me around especially the beginning of the book. So it was just a fantastic experience.
Nice.
But I think, as a designer, I'm still, I'm forever influenced, and I can still hear, for example, the voice of my teacher who's now long gone, Ochi-san Akira. I still learn from him. I know that sounds perhaps a little strange, but I feel like that's part of my desire to grow old as a designer. And another person that I look to greatly in that regard is Karl Martens, for obvious reasons, because he seems to fearlessly keep going in this direction. And it's just endlessly inspiring. But at the same time too, that's part of why I love teaching so much, because the challenges that you and I have been talking about today are also the inspiration too. To face the challenge of helping someone else understand is definitely frustrating at times. But here and there's those moments where you feel like, you've learned something too, and that's to me a big part of it as well.
Erik, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. I love talking to you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jarrett. It's such a pleasure. I really appreciate it. It's such an honor.
This episode was recorded on March 18th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.